Ma'am, you'll need to move to the back. This seat isn't for you. What happens when a man with wings on his chest tells the wrong woman to get to the back of the plane? He wasn't just a pilot. He was a king in his metal kingdom, 30,000 feet in the air. She wasn't just a passenger. She was the woman who built the kingdom and held the keys. The flight was 4 hours long, but it only took 10 seconds for his arrogance to ground him for life. This is the story of how a single demand to move triggered the downfall of an entire criminal operation, proving that karma isn't just in the air. It controls the entire sky. The hum of Chicago O'Hare International Airport was a familiar droning lullaby to Dr. Gabrielle Taylor. It was the sound of a system working of physics being harnessed of millions of lives moving from one point to another. To her, it was the sound of her life's work. She was a woman who lived in the details, the tensile strength of a turbine blade, the intricate routing of electrical systems, the psychological profile of a pilot undergoing stress. Today, however, she was just a passenger. Dressed in a simple, elegant navy blue pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a professional bun, Gabrielle looked like any other high-level consultant or lawyer. She carried a well-worn leather briefcase in one hand and her boarding pass on her phone in the other. Flight 842 to San Francisco, Seat 1A. First class. It was a small luxury afforded to her by her position, but one she utilized less for the comfort and more for the quiet. She needed to review the latest NTSB accident report before landing. As she navigated the crowded terminal, Gabrielle noticed the subtle shifts in people's behavior. The way a white businessman pulled his luggage slightly closer when she passed. How the barista at the coffee shop served the man behind her first, despite her being next in line. These were the small indignities she had navigated for 30 years in aviation, a field dominated by white men who often looked at her with surprise as if she had wandered into the wrong conference room. She had learned to pick her battles. Today was supposed to be just another undercover assessment flight, part of her ongoing investigation into passenger complaints about Global Airways. Nothing that would make headlines. Nothing that would change history. She boarded with Group 1, offering a polite nod to the flight attendant, Isabella Morales, who greeted her at the door. Isabella, young and Latina, with a bright professional smile, gestured her forward. "Welcome aboard, ma'am. Straight to your left." Gabrielle settled into 1A, the bulkhead seat. It offered ample legroom and a degree of privacy. She retrieved her noise-canceling headphones, her tablet, and a bottle of water, methodically arranging her space for the long flight. The cabin slowly filled a mixture of seasoned road warriors and excited vacationers. Then he appeared. Captain Richard Wilson was the kind of man who didn't just walk. He made an entrance. His uniform was impeccably pressed. His silver and black hair was perfect, and his smile was a high-wattage beam he used like a spotlight. He was the archetype of the hero pilot, the man whose voice was pure confidence over the PA system. He strode into the first-class cabin, not to prepare for departure, but with a clipboard in hand scanning the passengers. His eyes, a sharp blue, landed on Gabrielle. He paused, his smile tightening just a fraction. He looked at his clipboard, then back at her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire small cabin to hear. It wasn't the polite tone he'd used with the elderly white couple across the aisle. It was a tone of authority, of expectation. Gabrielle removed her headphones. "Yes, Captain, I'm going to need you to move," he said flatly. He didn't say please. He didn't say, "Would you mind?" He made a statement. Gabrielle blinked, momentarily confused. "I'm sorry. Is there a problem with the seat?" "There's a problem with the manifest," Wilson said, tapping his clipboard. "We need this seat for a deadheading crew member. Weight and balance. You'll need to move." He gestured vaguely toward the back of the plane. "We can find you something in Economy Plus." Gabrielle's gaze remained perfectly steady. She had spent 30 years in a world dominated by men like Richard Wilson, men who equated confidence with competence and authority with infallibility. She also knew the Federal Aviation Regulations Title 14, Part 121 by heart. Weight and balance. Gabrielle repeated, her voice soft but clear. Captain, a single passenger moving from 1A to 23C won't affect the center of gravity on a 757, and if it did, this aircraft would have a serious certification issue. Furthermore, any deadheading crew would have been assigned a jump seat or a manifest listed seat prior to boarding. The cabin, which had been buzzing with pre-flight chatter, went silent. Everyone was watching. Wilson's smile vanished completely. His face flushed a dull red. He had been publicly questioned, and by a black woman who hadn't immediately shrunk under his command. "Ma'am, I am the pilot in command of this aircraft," he said, his voice low and menacing. "My orders are not suggestions. For security and operational reasons, I am telling you to move now." He was escalating. This was no longer a request. It was a threat. He was leveraging the post-9/11 authority granted to pilots to remove any passenger they deemed interfering with flight operations. The flight attendant, Isabella, looked mortified. "Captain, perhaps I can stay out of this?" Isabella Wilson snapped without looking at her. He turned his full intimidating glare back to Gabrielle. "We can do this the easy way, or I can have you removed from the flight for non-compliance. Your choice." Gabrielle Taylor looked at the man who held the lives of 180 passengers in his hands. She saw the arrogance, the unchecked ego, and the subtle, ugly prejudice that fueled it. He didn't see a passenger. He saw someone he could displace. A Hispanic businessman in 2C shifted uncomfortably, clearly troubled by what was unfolding. An older white woman in 2B frowned, her eyes darting between Wilson and Gabrielle. The cabin had become a silent courtroom with Wilson as judge and executioner. Gabrielle had seen this behavior before, not just directed at her, but at countless others who didn't match the profile of belonging in first class, in cockpits, in control towers. She'd spent her career documenting it, fighting it, changing policies to prevent it. She slowly, deliberately reached into her briefcase. For a second, Wilson tensed as if expecting a confrontation. Instead, Gabrielle pulled out a small laminated card and her phone. "You're right, Captain. You are the pilot in command," Gabrielle said, her voice like ice. "You have ultimate authority over this flight. But you are operating that flight under a license granted by the Federal Aviation Administration. And as the pilot in command, you should know that using security as a pretext to arbitrarily move a paying passenger is a gross violation of procedure." She held up the card. It was bland official, but the gold seal of the Department of Transportation and the letters FAA were unmistakable. "Dr. Gabrielle Taylor, Director of Aviation Safety and Standards," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "I am not moving from this seat, and I am formally notifying you that as of this moment, you are under investigation for crew member interference and potential passenger discrimination." Captain Wilson's face went from red to a sickly pale white. The clipboard slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the carpet. I didn't. I am the passenger in 1A, Gabrielle said, placing her card back in her briefcase. "Now, if you're quite finished threatening me, I'd like to get to San Francisco. Or would you prefer to declare yourself unfit for duty due to your agitation? Because I can arrange for a replacement pilot. It will only delay us an hour or two." Wilson was trapped. He was staring at the single most powerful woman in American aviation safety. He had just tried to bully his own executioner. He swallowed his throat dry. He bent, retrieved his clipboard, and without another word turned and fled to the cockpit, slamming the door behind him. The first-class cabin was dead quiet. Gabrielle Reed calmly put her headphones back on, opened her tablet to the NTSB report, and took a sip of her water. The flight attendant, Isabella, approached her trembling. "Dr. Taylor, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Can I get you anything?" Gabrielle looked up, her expression softening for the young woman. "A coffee, please. Black. And Isabella, you might want to start documenting everything Captain Wilson does from this point forward. It will be helpful." Isabella nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and, strangely, relief. As she rushed to the galley, Gabrielle turned to her phone. The in-flight Wi-Fi wasn't active yet, but she didn't need it. She sent a text message to a number saved in her favorites. "Ben, we have a problem. I want a full history incident reports and psych evals on Captain Richard Wilson, Global Airways ID 74W. Expedite. I want it before we land." The reply came seconds later. "On it, Director." The plane began its push back from the gate. The battle for Seat 1A was over, but the war for accountability in the skies had just begun. The Hispanic businessman across the aisle leaned slightly toward her. "Dr. Taylor," he said quietly. "Carlos Rodriguez, West Coast Legal Group." He discreetly passed her a business card. "I witnessed everything. If you need another statement, please call." Gabrielle took the card with a small nod of thanks. Allies appeared in unexpected places sometimes. As the plane taxied, she could feel the stares of the other passengers. Some curious, some grateful, others uncomfortable. The power dynamic they had all accepted as normal, the absolute authority of the uniformed pilot, had been upended before their eyes. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about who had the right to occupy space, to question authority, to demand respect. Over the PA system, Wilson's voice came through, noticeably strained, as he welcomed passengers aboard Flight 842 to San Francisco. The professional veneer was intact, but Gabrielle could hear the tremor of fear underneath. Isabella returned with coffee, and a small note slipped under the saucer. "I've seen him do this before. 2 others. Never reported. Too scared. Thank you." Gabrielle glanced up at her, giving a small nod of acknowledgement. She'd seen this pattern too many times in her 30 years. One incident was rarely isolated. It was usually the tip of a very deep iceberg. As the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, Gabrielle opened her tablet and accessed a secure FAA database. Her text to Benjamin Reynolds, her deputy director, had already triggered a preliminary background search on Wilson. The initial results were troubling. 3 passenger complaints in the past year, all involving minority passengers who alleged unfair treatment. All dismissed due to insufficient evidence or passenger misunderstanding of safety procedures. The pattern was clear to her trained eye. Equally clear was the absence of any meaningful investigation. More disturbing were the notes from 2 former first officers who had requested transfers away from Wilson's command. Their official reasons were vague professional differences, seeking varied experience. But Gabrielle recognized the language of those afraid to speak directly. She made notes flagging areas for deeper investigation. This wasn't just about one incident of discrimination. There was something more pervasive here, a culture that enabled Wilson's behavior. And in aviation, where safety depended on honest communication and adherence to rules, a culture of fear and intimidation was dangerous on multiple levels. Halfway through the flight, Isabella approached again, her professional smile masking the concern in her eyes. "Dr. Taylor, Captain Wilson has requested that I inform you we'll be experiencing turbulence shortly. He recommends all passengers remain seated with seatbelts fastened for the remainder of the flight." Gabrielle glanced out the window at the cloudless blue sky. There were no weather systems on their route that would cause significant turbulence. This was either incompetence or pettiness. Neither was acceptable in a commercial pilot. "Thank you, Isabella." "Has he made this announcement to all passengers?" "No, ma'am. Just you." "I see. Please inform Captain Wilson that I'll be documenting this interaction as well." Isabella nodded and retreated. Minutes later, Wilson's voice came over the PA system announcing potential turbulence to all passengers. Gabrielle made another note. Petty retaliation was often the first sign of a pilot who prioritized ego over safety. As the California coast came into view, Gabrielle's phone pinged with an encrypted message from Reynolds. The preliminary background check had revealed more red flags. Wilson had been the subject of an internal investigation at his previous airline, Eastern Pacific, regarding crew resource management issues. The details were sealed in a confidential settlement. His move to Global Airways had been abrupt and without the customary peer recommendations. Most concerning was a maintenance log discrepancy flagged 3 months earlier. Wilson had signed off on a delayed inspection citing operational necessity. The maintenance chief had objected but was overruled. The FAA had not been notified as required. This wasn't just about a first-class seat anymore. This was potentially about passenger safety on a much broader scale. The descent into San Francisco was smooth despite the non-existent turbulence Wilson had predicted. As they taxied to the gate, Gabrielle noticed Wilson had not emerged from the cockpit for the customary farewell to passengers standard procedure for Global Airways. Another small violation of protocol. Another note made. Isabella approached one final time. Dr. Taylor, I have some information that might be relevant. I've kept a personal log of incidents. Captain Wilson isn't the only one. It's a pattern at Global, especially with certain captains and certain passengers. I'd very much like to see that log, Ms. Morales. I'll email it tonight. And there are others who would talk if they knew they'd be protected. They will be, Gabrielle assured her. You have my word. As the aircraft reached the gate, Gabrielle was surprised to see 4 individuals in FAA windbreakers waiting in the jet bridge. Benjamin Reynolds worked fast. Wilson would be met by investigators before he could even leave the aircraft. When the door opened, Gabrielle remained seated, allowing other passengers to deplane first. She watched through the cockpit door, which had been opened for arrival. Wilson was still in his seat, completing paperwork, unaware of what awaited him. As the last passenger left, she stood and approached the cockpit. Wilson looked up, his expression hardening when he saw her. Captain Wilson, I believe there are some people waiting to speak with you. Her voice was professional without malice or triumph. This wasn't personal for her. It was about the integrity of a system meant to keep millions safe. Wilson stepped out of the cockpit to find the FAA team waiting. The lead investigator, a stern-faced woman in her 40s, stepped forward. Captain Wilson, I'm Investigator Helen Dawson, FAA Safety Division. I need to inform you that you're being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into today's incident and other matters of concern. I'll need your company ID and credentials before you leave the aircraft. Wilson's face contorted with disbelief and rage. He turned to Gabrielle. This is an overreaction to a simple misunderstanding. You're destroying my career over a seat assignment. Gabrielle regarded him calmly. This isn't about a seat, Captain. This is about judgment authority and the culture of safety or lack thereof that you represent. The investigation will determine the rest. As Wilson surrendered his credentials, the reality of his situation seemed to sink in. His shoulders slumped. The king had been dethroned in his own kingdom. Benjamin Reynolds appeared from behind the investigators, a tall, imposing African-American man with salt and pepper hair and an air of unflappable calm. He had been Gabrielle's right hand for 15 years. Director Taylor, he greeted her formally. We've arranged for a replacement captain for the return flight, and we've secured a conference room at SFO for immediate debriefing. Gabrielle nodded. Thank you, Ben. I think we have a lot to discuss. As they walked through the terminal, leaving Wilson with the investigators, Reynolds lowered his voice. This isn't going to be simple. Wilson has connections. The CEO of Global Airways already called the commissioner. Let him call. This isn't going away with a phone call. What exactly happened up there? Textbook discrimination wrapped in the guise of authority. But it's what I found afterward that concerns me more. This isn't just about one pilot with a power complex. I think we've stumbled onto something much bigger. In the airport conference room, Gabrielle laid out what she had discovered during the flight. The past complaints, the maintenance irregularities, the culture of silence among crew. Reynolds nodded grimly. I'll get a full team on this. But be prepared, Gabby. Global Airways won't go down without a fight. Neither will I, Ben. Neither will I. 3 days later, Gabrielle sat in her temporary office at the San Francisco FAA field office surrounded by stacks of personnel files, maintenance logs, and flight records. What had begun as a routine assessment flight had expanded into a full-scale investigation into Global Airways operations. Wilson's personnel file painted a disturbing picture. 25 years of service, decorated military background, impeccable technical ratings, and a trail of interpersonal incidents that had been consistently downplayed or buried. Complaints from female first officers about his condescending behavior. Reports from flight attendants about his disregard for their safety concerns. Passenger complaints that mysteriously disappeared from the system. Most telling were the performance reviews, glowing assessments of his technical skills that completely omitted any mention of teamwork or communication issues. It was as if the company had deliberately created a paper trail that acknowledged only half of what made a good pilot. Benjamin Reynolds entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." Gabrielle admitted accepting the coffee gratefully. "The more I dig, the worse it gets. Wilson isn't an anomaly, Ben. He's a symptom." She gestured to a spreadsheet on her tablet. "I've cross-referenced maintenance logs with flight schedules and crew assignments. There's a pattern. Certain pilots, Wilson among them, have been signing off on shortened maintenance checks. Always on high-revenue routes, always when delays would be costly." "That's a serious violation," Reynolds said, frowning. "It gets worse. Those same pilots are consistently paired with specific maintenance chiefs, and they all report directly to one man, James Harrington, VP of Operations." Reynolds let out a low whistle. "So it's not just a rogue pilot. It's an organized operation." "Exactly. But I can't prove it yet. I need more. I need someone on the inside to talk." As if on cue, her phone buzzed with a text. It was Isabella Morales asking to meet. She had information, but she was afraid to come to the FAA office. "I need to go," Gabrielle said, grabbing her jacket. "I may have found our first whistleblower." They met at a quiet cafe near Union Square, far from the airport and any likely Global Airways employees. Isabella was dressed in civilian clothes, constantly checking over her shoulder. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice low. "I wasn't sure if I should come forward, but after what I saw, what you did, I can't stay silent anymore." She pulled out a small notebook, its pages dog-eared and filled with neat handwriting. "I've been keeping this for 3 years. Every incident, every comment, every time a pilot like Wilson abused their authority. Dates, times, witnesses." Gabrielle leafed through the notebook. It was a damning record of a toxic culture. Minority passengers singled out for additional scrutiny. Female crew members facing harassment. Safety concerns dismissed. "This is incredibly valuable, Isabella. But I have to ask, why didn't you report these incidents before?" Isabella's eyes dropped. "I tried. Once, 2 years ago. I filed a formal complaint when Captain Wilson made a female first officer cry after she questioned his decision to fly through a storm cell. The next day, I was called into James Harrington's office. He told me I had misunderstood normal cockpit dynamics and that further misunderstandings would affect my performance reviews." "Classic intimidation," Gabrielle murmured. "It's not just Wilson," Isabella continued. "There's a group of them, senior captains who protect each other, and they're all connected to Harrington. They call themselves the Old Guard. What about maintenance issues?" "Have you noticed anything there?" Isabella nodded vigorously. "That's actually why I finally decided to meet you. Last month, I overheard Wilson and Captain Brennan discussing how they'd saved the company millions by streamlining maintenance. They saw me and stopped talking immediately." Gabrielle made notes. The picture was becoming clearer, but she needed hard evidence beyond hearsay. "Isabella, would you be willing to make an official statement? I understand the risk, but I can offer whistleblower protection." Isabella took a deep breath. "If you can guarantee my job is safe, yes. I can also give you names of others who might talk if they knew they were protected. You have my word. The FAA takes whistleblower protection very seriously. As they parted, Gabrielle felt a mixture of hope and concern. Isabella was taking a significant risk, and Gabrielle knew from experience how ruthless corporations could be when their profits were threatened. Back at the field office, Gabrielle was surprised to find Commissioner Lawrence had left 3 messages requesting an immediate call back. Thomas Lawrence was a political appointee with limited aviation experience but considerable connections in Washington. Gabrielle had always maintained a professionally distant relationship with him. She returned the call, putting it on speaker so Reynolds could listen. Director Taylor, finally. Lawrence's voice was tense. "I've been trying to reach you all day. I've just had Nathan Palmer, the CEO of Global Airways, in my office expressing serious concerns about your investigation. He feels you're overstepping based on a personal interaction. With all due respect, Commissioner, this investigation has moved well beyond the initial incident. We've uncovered potential violations of at least 6 major safety regulations, including falsified maintenance records. That's a serious allegation, Director. Do you have evidence?" "Building it as we speak. I have a whistleblower and documentary evidence of a pattern of violations." There was a pause on the other end. "Gabrielle, I need to be frank. Global Airways is a major carrier with significant economic impact. Palmer has friends in Congress. Before we go making accusations that could damage the company, we need to be absolutely certain." Gabrielle felt her jaw tighten. "Are you suggesting we ignore safety violations because the company is economically important, Commissioner?" "Of course not." Lawrence backpedaled quickly. "I'm merely suggesting discretion and absolute certainty before we proceed. Perhaps an informal meeting with Palmer could resolve." "I'll meet with Mr. Palmer when I have completed the preliminary investigation," Gabrielle cut in. "Not before. And with all due respect, sir, I would remind you that the FAA's primary mandate is safety, not protecting corporate interests." The line went quiet for a moment. "Very well, Director. But tread carefully. There are political realities here that cannot be ignored." After hanging up, Reynolds looked at her with concern. "They're mobilizing against us already." "Which means we're on the right track," Gabrielle replied unfazed. "When corporations start calling in political favors, it's because they're afraid of what we'll find." The next day brought an unexpected breakthrough. A man named Fernando Diaz contacted the FAA office asking specifically to speak with Gabrielle. Reynolds, who took the call, recognized the name immediately, a former Global Airways first officer who had left the company 2 years earlier under unclear circumstances. Diaz arrived looking nervous but determined. He was in his early 40s, with the crisp posture of a career pilot, but his eyes carried the weariness of someone who had fought and lost a battle. "I heard you're investigating Captain Wilson," he began without preamble. "I flew with him for 3 years as his first officer. I'm the reason he was investigated at Eastern Pacific before he came to Global." Gabrielle leaned forward. "Tell me." Diaz's story was troubling but familiar. Wilson had repeatedly violated weather minimums, flying into conditions below legal standards to maintain on-time performance. When Diaz had objected and documented the violations, Wilson had used his influence to have him labeled as overly cautious and not a team player. The final straw came when he falsified a weight and balance report to avoid offloading cargo on an overweight flight, Diaz explained. "I reported it to the chief pilot. 2 weeks later, I was transferred to a reserve position flying half the hours for much less pay. The message was clear, and the Eastern Pacific investigation Reynolds prompted. Buried. Wilson had friends in management. They reached a confidential agreement that allowed him to resign without a mark on his record. I was blackballed. Couldn't get hired anywhere except regional carriers at entry-level pay. "Why come forward now?" Gabrielle asked. Diaz met her eyes. "Because when I heard that the FAA director herself had experienced Wilson's behavior, I realized this might be the only chance to expose him and the others like him. It's not just Wilson, Dr. Taylor. It's a culture that values schedule over safety, profits over people, and it's getting worse. Would you be willing to make a sworn statement? That's why I'm here. I've got nothing left to lose. They've already taken my career. With Isabella's notebook and Diaz's testimony, Gabrielle had enough to justify expanding the investigation. She authorized a formal audit of Global Airways maintenance records for the past 3 years and requested access to their internal communication systems. The company's initial response was predictable, polite resistance wrapped in bureaucratic delays. But when Gabrielle made it clear that she was prepared to issue emergency safety directives that could ground their fleet, they reluctantly complied. What they found in the maintenance records was disturbing. A pattern of shortened inspections, deferred repairs, and parts replaced well beyond their service life. All neatly documented with the proper signatures, but all in violation of safety standards. Most concerning were the parts records. Certain critical components, turbine blades, hydraulic actuators, control surface elements, had been sourced not from certified manufacturers, but from a third-party supplier called Aerodynamic Solutions. The parts had proper paperwork, but something didn't add up in the certification chain. Gabrielle ordered a physical inspection of 3 Global Airways aircraft. The results confirmed her worst fears. The parts installed were visually identical to certified components, but lacked the material quality and precision engineering of genuine parts. They were sophisticated counterfeits, dangerous ones. "This is beyond Wilson now," she told Reynolds as they reviewed the findings. "This is corporate fraud on a massive scale. Counterfeit parts, falsified records, endangered passengers, all to save money. We need to involve the FBI," Reynolds said grimly. "This is criminal." Before they could, Gabrielle received an unexpected call from the maintenance chief at Global Airways San Francisco base, William Norton. He asked to meet privately away from the airport and company offices. They met at a small park near the bay. Norton was a stocky man in his 50s with calloused hands and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades around aircraft. He looked around nervously before speaking. "I heard you found the parts discrepancies," he said without introduction. "I've been trying to raise alarms about this for over a year." Nobody would listen. "Tell me everything," Gabrielle urged. Norton had been maintenance chief for 15 years. He described how about 3 years ago James Harrington had introduced a new cost-saving initiative that involved sourcing parts from Aerodynamic Solutions. The paperwork looked legitimate, but Norton had concerns about quality from the beginning. "When I raised issues, Harrington introduced me to a man named David Foster from the FAA certification office who assured me everything was compliant. But I've been in this business long enough to know when parts don't meet specs, even if they have the right paperwork." David Foster. Gabrielle exchanged a glance with Reynolds. "There is no David Foster in our certification division." Norton's face fell. "Then I've been participating in fraud. God help me." He explained how Wilson and several other senior captains were directly involved in the parts scheme. They would sign off on maintenance checks that certified the counterfeit parts as airworthy, overriding concerns from maintenance staff. It was always about keeping the planes flying, avoiding delays, maximizing utilization. Safety became secondary to schedule. "Why come forward now?" Reynolds asked. Norton looked down at his hands. "Last month I found stress fractures in a counterfeit turbine blade during inspection. If it had failed in flight..." He trailed off, the horrifying consequences clear to all of them. "I reported it to Harrington. He had the part replaced but buried my report. That's when I knew I couldn't be part of this anymore. But I didn't know who to trust until I heard about your investigation." Gabrielle placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Mr. Norton, and we'll need your testimony to make sure this stops before someone gets hurt." That evening, Gabrielle and Reynolds briefed a joint FAA-FBI task force. The investigation had expanded from a single incident of discrimination to a corporation-wide fraud scheme that endangered thousands of passengers daily. "We need to move quickly but carefully," Gabrielle instructed. We need search warrants for Aerodynamics Solutions and the offices of key Global Airways executives. We need forensic accountants to trace the money flow. And we need to identify every aircraft with potentially counterfeit parts. As the team dispersed to their assignments, Gabrielle's phone rang. It was a Washington, D.C. number she didn't recognize. Dr. Taylor, a smooth male voice said, "This is Senator James Mitchell, chair of the Transportation Committee. I understand you're conducting an investigation into Global Airways." Gabrielle's guard went up immediately. "That's correct, Senator. It's an ongoing investigation I can't discuss in detail. I'm not asking for details, Doctor. I'm merely suggesting that such investigations can have far-reaching economic impacts. Global employs 30,000 people across 15 states, including 7,000 in my state." The implication was clear. "Are you asking me to alter the course of a safety investigation based on economic considerations? Senator, I'm asking you to be judicious and consider the broader implications. I've known Nathan Palmer for 20 years. He runs a tight ship. If there are isolated incidents of misconduct, I'm certain he would address them internally. With respect, Senator, what we've uncovered goes well beyond isolated incidents. And I would remind you that my mandate is passenger safety, not corporate reputation management." "Very well." His tone cooled. "I've made my position clear. I hope you understand that actions have consequences, Dr. Taylor, for everyone involved." The threat was thinly veiled. Gabrielle had made a powerful enemy, but it only reinforced her determination. If a U.S. senator was trying to interfere with a safety investigation, the corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. The next morning, the FBI raided Aerodynamics Solutions' headquarters and manufacturing facility. What they found exceeded even Gabrielle's worst expectations. The company was essentially a sophisticated counterfeiting operation, producing parts that visually matched certified components but used substandard materials and manufacturing processes. More damning were the financial records. Aerodynamics had been making regular payments to offshore accounts linked to James Harrington and several Global Airways pilots, including Richard Wilson. The scheme had saved the airline millions in parts costs with kickbacks to the executives and pilots who facilitated it. With this evidence, Gabrielle authorized an emergency order grounding all Global Airways aircraft that had received parts from Aerodynamics until they could be inspected and certified safe. It was a drastic measure that would cost the airline millions, but passenger safety couldn't be compromised. The company's response was immediate and aggressive. Nathan Palmer. Global Airways' CEO called an emergency press conference denouncing the FAA's action as disproportionate and based on a personal vendetta. He cited the initial confrontation between Gabrielle and Wilson as evidence of bias and called for her recusal from the investigation. Gabrielle watched the press conference from her office, unmoved by the accusations. She had expected this, the attempt to personalize the investigation to make it about her rather than about corporate malfeasance. "They're desperate," Reynolds observed. "They know what we found." "Yes, but they're also dangerous," Gabrielle replied. "Palmer has resources and connections, and he just declared war." Her phone rang again. "Commissioner Lawrence." "Director Taylor." "I'm getting hammered by calls from the White House, Congress, and every aviation industry group. Palmer is claiming you've overstepped and that this grounding order is personal retaliation. The evidence supports the order, Commissioner. We have documented proof of counterfeit parts, falsified inspections, and deliberate safety violations. I'm prepared to defend this action before any committee or court." Lawrence sighed. "Palmer has requested a meeting. With you personally. I think you should take it. I'd be happy to meet with Mr. Palmer with FBI investigators present given the criminal nature of what we've uncovered. That's not what he had in mind." "Those are my terms, Commissioner. This isn't a negotiation about compliance. It's a criminal investigation now." After hanging up, Gabrielle turned to Reynolds. "They're trying to isolate me, make this about one woman with a grudge rather than corporate fraud. It won't work," Reynolds assured her. "The evidence is too strong. Evidence only matters if people see it, Ben. We need to make sure this story doesn't get buried." Later that day, Isabella Morales called with alarming news. Global Airways management had sent a memo to all employees warning against speaking to FAA investigators without company counsel present. Those who had already spoken were being identified and called in for clarification interviews. They're trying to intimidate witnesses, Gabrielle realized. Isabella, do not attend any such interview. You're under federal whistleblower protection now. If they threaten your job, document everything and call me immediately. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, a powerful corporation with political connections and billions at stake. On the other, Gabrielle and her team armed with evidence and the legal mandate to protect the flying public. That evening, as Gabrielle returned to her hotel, she noticed a car following her taxi. It stayed 2 vehicles behind, making the same turns. When she reached the hotel, it drove past slowly, the driver clearly observing her. Intimidation tactics. She'd seen them before in high-profile investigations. She made a note of the license plate and informed hotel security to be vigilant. This wasn't her first corporate investigation, and she knew the playbook well. But it was the first time she'd gone up against a corporation with this level of political protection. In her hotel room, Gabrielle reviewed her case notes, strengthening the chain of evidence that connected Wilson's behavior to the broader culture of corruption at Global Airways. His discrimination wasn't an isolated character flaw. It was part of a pattern of believing rules didn't apply to him, whether those rules concerned equal treatment or aircraft safety. Her phone rang again this time. It was a former mentor, retired FAA official, Grace Johnson. Gabby, I'm hearing things the older woman said without preamble. Palmer is pulling every string he has in Washington. He's trying to get the transportation secretary to intervene. Let him try, Gabrielle replied. We have the evidence. Evidence isn't always enough in Washington, and you know it. Be careful. Document everything. Trust no one outside your immediate team. I learned from the best Grace. Yes, you did. And that's why I know you'll win this. Just make sure you're prepared for how ugly it's going to get. After hanging up, Gabrielle stared out at the San Francisco skyline. She thought about all the passengers boarding planes every day, trusting that the system would keep them safe. Trusting that people like her would stand firm against those who would sacrifice safety for profit. It wasn't just about Wilson anymore, or even about Global Airways. It was about the integrity of the entire aviation safety system. And she would not back down. The joint FBI-FAA raid on Aerodynamics Solutions headquarters yielded mountains of evidence. In a secure conference room at the San Francisco Federal Building, Gabrielle reviewed the findings with Reynolds and FBI Special Agent Diana Martinez. It's even worse than we thought, Martinez said, spreading photos across the table. They weren't just counterfeiting a few parts. They had an entire operation mimicking certified aerospace components. High bypass turbine blades, hydraulic actuators, control surface components, all manufactured with substandard materials but perfect cosmetic appearance. Gabrielle examined a turbine blade virtually indistinguishable from a genuine part to the untrained eye. The level of sophistication here is frightening. The financial links are where it gets really interesting. Reynolds added, opening a laptop with forensic accounting data. Aerodynamics was essentially created to serve Global Airways. 90% of their output went to Global, with the remaining 10% spread among smaller carriers to maintain appearances. Martinez nodded. And the money trail is clear. Aerodynamics charged Global about 60% of what legitimate manufacturers would charge. The 40% savings was split half to Global's bottom line, the other half distributed as consulting fees to offshore accounts linked to Harrington Wilson and 5 other pilots who were part of their circle. What about Palmer? Gabrielle asked. The CEO had to know. No direct links yet, Martinez admitted. But we found regular encrypted communications between Harrington and an account we believe belongs to Palmer. They used a specialized aviation operations security system that was supposedly for contingency planning, but they were discussing profit margins and maintenance efficiencies. Gabrielle's jaw tightened. so Palmer maintained plausible deniability while benefiting from the scheme. Classic corporate strategy. There's more, Reynolds said gravely. We cross-referenced the counterfeit parts installation dates with incident reports. 3 unexplained engine shutdowns, a hydraulic failure, and a control surface anomaly in the past year alone, all on aircraft with aerodynamics parts installed. My God, Gabrielle whispered. They've been gambling with passengers' lives. And winning so far, Martinez added. No crashes, no fatalities. Just unexplained mechanical issues that were handled by their maintenance teams without FAA notification. Until now, Gabrielle said firmly, I want every Global Airways aircraft with these parts grounded immediately, and I want a team examining those incident reports. If they've been concealing reportable safety events, that's another federal violation. As they strategized next steps, Gabrielle's phone rang. It was Commissioner Lawrence again. Director Taylor, the Transportation Secretary, is convening an emergency meeting tomorrow morning in Washington. Your presence is required. I'm in the middle of a critical investigation, Commissioner. This isn't a request, Gabrielle. The White House is involved now. Palmer has convinced some people that this investigation is causing unnecessary economic damage. Gabrielle felt her anger rise. Economic damage. We've uncovered a criminal conspiracy that put thousands of lives at risk. I understand that. But politics is in play now. You need to make your case directly to the Secretary. After hanging up, Gabrielle turned to Reynolds and Martinez. They're trying to shut us down from the top. I need to go to Washington. I'll come with you, Reynolds offered. No, I need you here continuing the investigation. If they succeed in sidelining me, you'll need to carry this forward. She turned to Martinez. And I need the FBI to move quickly on criminal charges. Once those are filed, political interference becomes much harder. Martinez nodded. We'll have warrants for Harrington and Wilson by morning. Palmer will take longer. We need more evidence of direct knowledge. Before leaving for Washington, Gabrielle made one more stop, a face-to-face meeting with Nathan Palmer himself. Not the private meeting he'd requested, but a formal interview at the federal building with FBI agents present. Palmer arrived with 2 attorneys, his normally photogenic face tight with controlled anger. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired and tan, the picture of corporate success. Dr. Taylor, he said coldly, I'd hoped we could resolve this more collegially. Mr. Palmer, this investigation long ago moved beyond collegial resolution. We're now investigating criminal conspiracy, fraud, and willful violation of safety regulations. Palmer's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. Allegations without context. You've grounded our fleet based on isolated maintenance irregularities that we were already addressing internally. Isolated, Gabrielle slid a folder across the table. We've identified over 300 counterfeit critical components installed across your fleet. We've documented 7 serious incidents involving these parts that were never reported to the FAA as required. And we've traced millions in illegal payments to your executives and pilots. One of the attorneys placed a hand on Palmer's arm, cautioning him, but Palmer brushed it off. You've been on a crusade since Captain Wilson asked you to change seats. This is personal for you, and you're using your position to wage a vendetta against my company. Gabrielle didn't take the bait. Mr. Palmer, this investigation began because of Captain Wilson's behavior. Yes, but what we found goes far beyond one pilot's discrimination. We found a culture of corruption that starts at the top. She leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly. And let me be clear, if you knew about these counterfeit parts and the dangers they posed, you'll be facing criminal charges alongside Harrington and Wilson. If you didn't know, you're admitting incompetence as CEO. Palmer's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I built this airline from nothing. I have friends in every branch of government. Then you should use those connections to get a good criminal defense attorney, Mr. Palmer. Because we have the evidence and no amount of political pressure will make it disappear. As Palmer and his attorneys left, Reynolds gave Gabrielle a concerned look. "You just made an enemy for life. He was already an enemy. Now he knows I'm not intimidated." The next morning, Gabrielle flew to Washington for the meeting with Transportation Secretary Eleanor Barnes. As expected, Palmer had arrived ahead of her, no doubt lobbying key officials. The meeting was held in the Secretary's formal conference room with representatives from the Department of Transportation FAA leadership, including Commissioner Lawrence and economic advisors from the White House. Palmer sat confidently at the table, flanked by his company's government relations team. Secretary Barnes, a no-nonsense career public servant, opened the meeting. "We're here to address the emergency grounding order issued against Global Airways. Mr. Palmer has expressed concerns about both the justification and the economic impact of this action." Palmer spoke smoothly, portraying Global Airways as a victim of regulatory overreach based on minor compliance issues. He emphasized the economic damage stranded passengers' lost revenue threatened jobs, and subtly suggested that Gabrielle's order was influenced by her personal interaction with Wilson. When her turn came, Gabrielle didn't waste words on defense. She presented the evidence methodically, photos of counterfeit parts financial records, showing the kickback scheme incident reports that should have triggered FAA notification but were buried. "This isn't about one pilot's behavior or minor compliance issues," she concluded. "This is about a deliberate conspiracy to compromise safety for profit. Global Airways knowingly installed counterfeit critical components, concealed safety incidents, and created a culture where those who raised concerns were silenced." She placed a final document on the table. "And as of this morning, the FBI has executed arrest warrants for James Harrington and Richard Wilson on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and willful violation of transportation safety laws. This is no longer just an FAA regulatory matter, it's a criminal case." Palmer's confident expression faltered as murmurs spread around the table. Secretary Barnes studied the evidence with a deepening frown. "Mr. Palmer," Barnes said finally, "did you have knowledge of these parts irregularities?" "Absolutely not," Palmer insisted. "If these allegations are true, they represent actions by rogue employees acting without authorization. Global Airways is committed to safety above all else." "Then you won't object to full cooperation with the ongoing investigation," Gabrielle interjected, "including access to your personal communications with Mr. Harrington." Palmer's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but Gabrielle pressed her advantage. "In fact, Mr. Palmer, we have evidence suggesting you not only knew about the counterfeit parts, but actively encouraged their use to improve quarterly earnings. Unless you can prove otherwise, you may be facing criminal charges yourself." It was a calculated bluff. They had circumstantial evidence, but not yet a smoking gun linking Palmer directly. But the effect was immediate. Palmer's face went ashen. Secretary Barnes studied both of them, then spoke firmly. "The grounding order will remain in effect until every aircraft has been inspected and certified safe. The criminal investigation will proceed without interference. And Mr. Palmer, I suggest you focus on cooperating rather than obstructing." As the meeting adjourned, Palmer approached Gabrielle, his voice low and menacing. "You've made the biggest mistake of your career. When this is over, you won't even be qualified to direct traffic at a municipal airport." Gabrielle met his gaze calmly. "Threats from a man potentially facing federal prison don't concern me, Mr. Palmer. What concerns me is the safety of the flying public, something you clearly abandoned in favor of profit." Back in San Francisco the next day, the investigation accelerated. The FBI raid on Harrington's home had yielded a treasure trove, a personal laptop with encrypted emails between him and Palmer explicitly discussing the parts scheme, the smoking gun they needed. Palmer knew everything. Reynolds confirmed, reviewing the emails. He not only approved the counterfeit parts program, he came up with the idea after meeting with the founder of Aerodynamics at a golf tournament. "That explains his reaction when I bluffed about having evidence against him," Gabrielle observed. He knew such evidence existed. The news of Wilson and Harrington's arrests had broken across all major networks. The story was evolving from an aviation industry matter to a major corporate scandal. Passengers were canceling Global Airways reservations en masse. The company's stock had plummeted 60% in 2 days. Isabella Morales called with news from inside the company. "It's chaos, Dr. Taylor. They've called an all-hands meeting tomorrow. Rumor is they're announcing major changes to try to save the company. Stay safe, Isabella. And remember your whistleblower protection is in place. They can't legally touch you." "I know, and I'm not worried anymore. Other crew members are speaking up now too. The culture of fear is breaking down." The next morning brought confirmation of Palmer's direct involvement. An executive assistant from his office came forward with notes from meetings where Palmer had explicitly directed Harrington to make the parts issue disappear and keep the FAA in the dark. With this final piece of evidence, the FBI secured an arrest warrant for Nathan Palmer on charges of conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and endangering aircraft safety charges that carried potential sentences of up to 30 years. Palmer was arrested at Global Airways headquarters during the all-hands meeting, led away in handcuffs in front of hundreds of employees. The company's board of directors issued an emergency statement announcing his suspension and promising full cooperation with investigators. As the case moved toward prosecution, Gabrielle focused on the regulatory aspects. Every Global Airways aircraft was undergoing thorough inspection. The counterfeit parts were being replaced with certified components. New safety protocols were being implemented under FAA supervision. But the most significant change was cultural. With Wilson Harrington and Palmer removed, employees began speaking freely about the toxic environment that had existed. Stories emerged of safety concerns ignored, of whistleblowers pushed out of a company where schedule and profit consistently trumped safety. In the midst of this organizational upheaval, Gabrielle received an unexpected visitor at her temporary San Francisco office, Carlos Rodriguez, the Hispanic businessman who had witnessed the original confrontation on the plane. "Dr. Taylor," he greeted her warmly. "I've been following the case with great interest. What began with one man's discrimination has uncovered corruption that endangered thousands. It's remarkable. Sometimes pulling one thread unravels the entire garment," Gabrielle replied, "though I never anticipated how big this would become." "That's why I'm here," Rodriguez explained. "My law firm specializes in corporate accountability. We're preparing a class action suit against Global Airways on behalf of passengers who flew on aircraft with counterfeit parts. Their lives were put at risk without their knowledge. The criminal cases will certainly provide plenty of evidence for your suit," Gabrielle noted. "Yes, but I wanted to thank you personally. Had you not stood your ground that day, had you moved when Wilson demanded it, none of this would have come to light. More lives would have been endangered. Your courage made all the difference." Gabrielle considered this. It wasn't courage so much as duty. When you're entrusted with public safety, you can't look away from wrongdoing, no matter how powerful the wrongdoer. As Rodriguez left, Gabrielle reflected on the chain of events that had led from a first-class seat confrontation to the unraveling of a corporate criminal conspiracy. It reminded her of why she had entered civil service 30 years earlier. The belief that systems could be held accountable, that rules existed for reasons that transcended profit and convenience. The investigation would continue for months. The legal proceedings against Wilson Harrington and Palmer would likely take years. But a critical corner had been turned. A culture of corruption that had festered in darkness had been exposed to light, and the skies were safer for it. 6 months later, Gabrielle sat in the formal hearing room of the National Transportation Safety Board. The room was packed: aviation industry representatives, media, Global Airways employees, past and present. At the front table sat Richard Wilson, hollow-eyed and diminished, flanked by his attorneys. This was the culmination of the FAA's regulatory case against Wilson, a public hearing to determine the fate of his pilot's license and, by extension, his career. The NTSB chairman, a stern former judge named Howard Mitchell, called the hearing to order. We are here to determine whether Captain Richard Wilson's actions constitute violations of federal aviation regulations warranting revocation of his airline transport pilot certificate. Dr. Taylor, as the initiating official, please present the FAA's case. Gabrielle approached the podium conscious of all eyes upon her. This wasn't about personal vindication. It was about establishing that no pilot, regardless of seniority or connections, was above the regulations designed to ensure safety. Chairman Mitchell, board members, the FAA's case against Captain Wilson encompasses two distinct but related areas of misconduct. First, his discriminatory treatment of passengers and abuse of authority, which demonstrates a fundamental lack of judgment required of commercial pilots. Second, his willing participation in a criminal conspiracy to install counterfeit parts on commercial aircraft, directly endangering passenger safety. Over the next hour, she methodically presented the evidence testimony from Isabella and other crew members about Wilson's pattern of discriminatory behavior, documentation of his role in approving substandard parts financial records showing his personal gain from the scheme. Most damning was Wilson's own testimony in the criminal proceedings, where he had admitted to knowing the parts were counterfeit, but justified it as helping the company stay competitive. When she concluded, Wilson's attorney attempted to separate the discrimination issue from the parts scandal, arguing that they were unrelated matters and that the original incident was merely a misunderstanding about operational needs. Isabella Morales was called to testify next. Despite visible nervousness, her voice grew stronger as she described the culture of fear Wilson and others had created. Captain Wilson didn't just discriminate against Dr. Taylor that day. It was a pattern. Minority passengers were regularly treated differently. Female crew members were dismissed or belittled when raising concerns. Safety protocols were ignored when they inconvenienced him. And anyone who objected was labeled not a team player and sidelined. Wilson's attorney cross-examined her aggressively, suggesting she was exaggerating to advance her own career. Isabella remained composed. "Sir, I risked my entire career to come forward. I had nothing to gain and everything to lose. I spoke up because passengers' lives were at risk and because what I witnessed day after day violated everything I believed aviation should stand for." The testimony continued for hours. Former colleagues of Wilson described his gradual evolution from a respected pilot to a rule breaker who believed his experience placed him above regulations. Maintenance workers detailed how he had pressured them to sign off on inspections that hadn't been properly completed. Finally, Wilson himself was called. Once imposing in his captain's uniform, he now wore a simple suit that seemed to hang on his frame. The months since his arrest had visibly aged him. Captain Wilson, the chairman, began, "Do you wish to make a statement before this board regarding the charges against you?" Wilson cleared his throat. "I've been a pilot for 35 years. I've logged over 22,000 flight hours without a single accident. I've brought passengers safely through storms, equipment malfunctions, and every challenge the skies could present." He paused, seeming to search for words. "The parts situation. I believed the parts were safe. I was assured they met specifications. Perhaps I should have questioned more, verified independently. For that lapse in judgment, I accept responsibility." His voice hardened slightly. "But regarding the incident with Dr. Taylor, I reject the characterization of discrimination. I was acting in what I believed to be the operational interests of the flight. If my approach was perceived as disrespectful, that was not my intent." Gabrielle listened impassively. Even now, facing the end of his career, Wilson couldn't fully acknowledge his behavior. The entitlement was too deeply ingrained. After a brief deliberation, the board returned with their decision. Chairman Mitchell addressed the room. "This board has reviewed the extensive evidence presented regarding Captain Richard Wilson's conduct. We have considered his distinguished flight record and his years of service. However, the evidence clearly establishes that Captain Wilson repeatedly violated the trust placed in him as a commercial pilot. His discriminatory treatment of passengers and crew created an unsafe operational environment. His willing participation in the counterfeit parts scheme directly endangered the lives of thousands. The privilege of holding an airline transport pilot certificate carries with it the highest standards of judgment, integrity, and commitment to safety. Captain Wilson has demonstrated that he no longer meets these standards. The chairman's gavel struck the desk with finality. It is therefore the decision of this board that Richard Wilson's pilot certificates are permanently revoked. He is prohibited from operating any commercial aircraft in United States airspace for life. This hearing is adjourned. A murmur rippled through the room. Wilson sat motionless, staring straight ahead, as the reality sank in. His career was over. His identity as a pilot, the source of his authority and status for decades, had been stripped away. As the room cleared, Isabella approached Gabrielle. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing me, for making this possible." "You're the one who took the real risk," Gabrielle replied. "What will you do now?" Isabella smiled slightly. "Global's new management has created a safety advocacy division. They've asked me to help develop training to ensure crew members feel empowered to report concerns without fear of retaliation. It's not what I expected, but it feels important." "It is important," Gabrielle assured her. "Cultural change is as critical as regulatory compliance." "I'm proud of you, Isabella." 2 weeks later, the criminal trial of Nathan Palmer began in federal court. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Emails, financial records, witness testimony all pointed to his role as the architect of the counterfeit parts scheme. Gabrielle testified about the investigation's findings, maintaining her professional demeanor despite Palmer's glares from the defense table. This wasn't personal for her. It was about accountability at the highest levels. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Palmer, the once untouchable CEO, was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. James Harrington received 15 years. Wilson, who had cooperated after his initial arrest, received a somewhat lighter sentence of 10 years. The financial penalties were equally severe. Global Airways was fined $1.7 billion, the largest safety violation penalty in aviation history. The company barely survived emerging from the scandal with new ownership, new management, and a mandate to rebuild its safety culture from the ground up. In the aftermath, Gabrielle was invited to speak at the company's first all-staff safety summit. Standing before hundreds of employees in a hangar at San Francisco International Airport, she saw not hostility, but hope, people who had been freed from a toxic culture and were eager to rebuild. "Aviation safety isn't built on regulations alone," she told them. "It's built on a culture where every voice matters, where concerns are heard, where doing the right thing matters more than schedules or statistics. For too long, this company operated under different values. Today marks a new beginning." She gestured to the aircraft behind her, a Global Airways 737 with a new paint scheme emphasizing safety and integrity. These machines are marvels of engineering, but they're only as safe as the human systems that support them, the mechanics who maintain them honestly, the pilots who operate them according to established procedures, the attendants who ensure passenger safety without fear of retaliation for raising concerns. The Taylor-Reynolds protocol being implemented across your company today isn't just about anonymous reporting mechanisms or protection for whistleblowers. It's about creating a culture where such protections are rarely needed because speaking up is encouraged, not punished. As she concluded her remarks, Gabrielle noticed Isabella standing with a group of young flight attendants, all listening intently. The young woman who had found the courage to come forward was now helping others find their voices. It was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the entire case. 1 year to the day after the confrontation on Flight 842, Gabrielle boarded another aircraft, this time bound for Chicago. She had been invited to receive the Aviation Safety Foundation's highest honor for her role in uncovering the Global Airways scandal. As she settled into her seat, 2B economy plus a young pilot appeared in the cabin conducting pre-flight checks. He noticed her and immediately straightened. "Dr. Taylor," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "It's an honor to have you aboard." "Truly." "Thank you, Captain," she replied with a small smile. "Just a safe flight is all I need." Of course, he assured her earnestly. "We've all studied the Global Airways case now. It's required reading at our training academy. What you did changed everything, how we think about safety, about speaking up, about true leadership." As he returned to the cockpit, Gabrielle gazed out the window at the airport activity below. She thought about all that had transpired from that moment when Richard Wilson had demanded she give up her seat. It hadn't been about the seat, really. It had been about power and who deserved respect. Wilson had seen a black woman and automatically assumed she was less deserving than whatever colleague he wanted to accommodate. He couldn't have known she was the FAA director, but that wasn't the point. No passenger should be treated that way regardless of title or position. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky. Below San Francisco receded the airport, becoming a complex pattern of runways and terminals. Somewhere down there, Richard Wilson was serving his sentence, his wings permanently clipped. Nathan Palmer was beginning his decades in federal prison, and Global Airways was rebuilding slowly, regaining public trust under new leadership committed to safety. Gabrielle closed her eyes briefly. She hadn't set out to bring down a corporation or end careers. She had simply refused to move when moving would have meant accepting discrimination. That small act of resistance had pulled a thread that unraveled years of corruption and neglect. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, she opened her briefcase and began reviewing documents for her next investigation. The work of ensuring aviation safety never ended. There would always be those who placed profit above people, convenience above compliance, ego above ethics. But as long as there were also those willing to stand firm to refuse to move when moving meant compromising integrity, the system would correct itself. That was the legacy of Flight 842. Not just justice for one incident of discrimination, but a transformation that made the skies safer for everyone. All because one woman had stayed in her seat and held her ground. If this story moved you, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of justice and accountability. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that standing up for what's right, even in the face of power and privilege, can create real change. Remember, sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is simply refuse to move when justice is on the line. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and if you've ever witnessed someone standing their ground against discrimination. Until next time, fly safe and stay strong.